are thankful for our past, but we're also thankful for the future. Help us to realize we'll have neither unless we have both. In Christ's name, amen.
Yes, speaking of our future, did you notice out there on the historic walk, some of the tiles have dates on them, things that have already happened. But there's enough blank tiles to last us until 2052. So Loma Linda planned, that if the Lord doesn't come, we can at least last here until 2052. So Gil and I and Zach, we went to Washington, D.C. for we say Washington, it was in Maryland actually, for the conference. It was delightful for me because I've been out of academia for 20 years and now I get to see a conference again. We started at the HMS Richards Hall at Washington Adventist University, and then we moved to the General Conference in the afternoon and for the second day. And when we got to the General Conference, they took us on a tour of the Ellen White Visitor Center. And we all sat there, we had Adventist scholars and non-Adventist scholars, and all the parts of the history of the church were highlighted. And I had never realized that on this thing, you can't see it very well, but on this thing right there is a picture of Scottsboro Sanitarium. And this is my wife's alma mater. This is where she got her physical therapy degree. Not only that, but there are two little dormitory cottages there where she lived. So her college home is there on that thing. Now on the other end is some of the people are recognizable. You can see Neil Wilson marching there on the way to heaven. And you can see C.E. Bradford. Now there's also, you will see some people falling off the path down into the wicked world below that God has rejected. And Alfred Lee, the artist, has turned most of those people to the wall. But I thought, if I was really mischievous, I could get into Photoshop, put a face on some of those folk. I have some candidates. But anyway, in the archives, we looked on the shelves, and there were 19 volumes of the Joseph Smith papers, done in immaculate scholarly, Critical editions. Critical editions, Joseph Smith papers, yes indeed. Now, let me just say this, that if you want to know what happened, if you go to the GC Archives site, there it is, AdventistArchives.org, the whole program is there, and you can see all the speakers and everything. And then he will be back in 2 weeks, and he will speak more specifically about some of the topics. This program, especially the second day, was live streamed using this kind of equipment. Now, I think that our pictures are a little better than that, but the nice thing about having this live stream thing is that you can, the operator sits there with his cell phone, and he can zoom and pan and everything, and then they put it up online. So if you go to YouTube and you click on Situating Adventist History Conference, you'll be able to see all of these. And if you choose this one here, you'll see Gil's presentation and my presentation. So that's there. Now this was our beginning day in the basement of the HMS Richards Hall, and somebody took a picture of us, and there I was. I got in the review for the first time in years. These were some of the speakers on the first day: Nicholas Miller, David Holland, and Zach, I think you're going to talk about this man's presentation next week, so we're not going to cover that one, but we want to mention these folk. So let's go here. Nicholas Miller, Adventism, Fundamentalism, and the Bible. Now, Gil, tell us what was some of his main points?
Do you have the next slide?
No.
We know that this conference was a significant conference, a really significant conference, because the banner headline on the Review and Herald website the next day related to the talk that Nick Miller had given. And this huge banner headline was, Adventists are not fundamentalists. You don't see that kind of headline every day. But it was a major headline, and the photograph, the one just before this one, go back, this was the photograph that Ron was telling us about. And Ron's not fundamentalist, so the headline was right on that. But there are two good non-Adventist presenters in this collection of people. Good Mormon here and a Jewish presenter, the other side. So this was a significant departure, I think, for the study of Adventist history, where a conference sponsored by the GC and by the Association of Adventist Historians and Washington Adventist University had invited a range of speakers. An Anglican, a Jewish person, a Mormon, and a Baptist, as well as a range of fundamentalist and non-fundamentalist Adventist speakers.
Yeah.
But the theme that really set the tone for the conference and the overarching theme was the presentation by Nick Miller, in which he asserted that Adventists are not really fundamentalists. And he was addressing philosophical issues, showing why, from a philosophical perspective, Adventists are not fundamentalists. But of course, that's one way of looking at things. There are many who would assert that Adventists are fundamentalists, and we'll talk a little bit more about this towards the end of our talk, because the real challenge that Adventists have is that when we first set out our understanding of inspiration in 1883, we said that sure, you can change the words of the Bible and the words of Ellen White, you can change those, but you cannot change the meaning at all. So we are, in fact, not verbal inerrantists, but practical inerrantists. And that posed problems for Prescott and for many others even today. So we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later. But that was the major theme of Nick Miller's presentation.
Yes, and then one of the most interesting ones was David Holland. His talk was about Seventh-day Adventists, Latter-day Saints, and Christian Scientists and ontological revelations and so on and so forth. This is a very interesting man. This David Holland is the son of one of the 12 apostles of the Mormon Church. He is himself a bishop in his local stake, which is a lay pastor sort of thing, and he is the author of the book Sacred Borders, which has 3 or 4 pages, very insightful pages about Ellen White, and he is working on and about to publish a joint biography of Ellen White and Mary Baker Eddy, which will be very, very interesting, I am sure. Kevin Burton was there from Florida State, and he talked about Seventh-day Adventist soldiers and the church's political rhetoric during the Civil War. What did he show us? Gil, what did he show us?
Yeah, some new insights about Adventist relationship to the Civil War. He'd done some very detailed study. Previously, Adventist historians have looked at policy statements from the Review and Herald and actions from the minutes of the church. But Kevin Burton tried to get a handle on how many Adventists actually served in the military during the Civil War and tried to get an understanding from the ground up. So he was looking through all of the letters that have been published in the Review and catching mentions of people serving in the military. He claims that he has 70 named people serving in the military during the Civil War, and 55 of those had volunteered, and that was new to us. We thought that Adventists might be conscripted, but certainly not volunteering. But he has 55 names of people who volunteered, 15 who were enlisted, and a cluster of others. And he asserts that that certainly isn't the whole range of those who served in the military. He's done some statistical analysis, population analysis, and he asserts that up to 350 Adventists at one time or other were serving in the military during the Civil War, almost 10% of the Adventist population, which was about 3,500 at the time, although White would say later.
And that doesn't count all of the soldiers who paid commutation fees, $300,
Yeah,
to have
to get
somebody
out of
else
the
go
service.
in for them, which almost bankrupted the church.
Yeah,
At the very end, Adventists had a four-day fasting and prayer, and then the Civil War ended, and so we claimed
responsibility
for ending the Civil War.
That's exactly how it was. But just before we leave Kevin Burton,
Yeah.
because there are two other really interesting new insights from his research. He has discovered that the problem in our own, in the church is getting a recognition from the government of non-combatant status, was achieved by J.N. Andrews in late 1864. But what lay behind that was a real conflict between James White and Snook and Brinkerhoff, who were the president and secretary respectively of the Iowa Conference. The Iowa Conference had tried to do it on their own, trying to get recognition of non-combatant status, and they had done it, made their application on the basis of a very strict pacifism. Not just cooperation, but pacifism. And they lost the case. And that really alarmed James White, because he thought that might spread around the whole church and we might be in real trouble. What came out of that incident in Iowa, the town called Marion, was that Snook and Brinkerhoff finally said, well, if you're not going to do it this way, we'll separate and do it our own way. And they formed a new movement. It was the first major schism in the Adventist church. And it still exists today. The Church of God, Seventh Day, that thing that Armstrong used to be connected with, has about 34,000 members in America and about 200,000 overseas. And they are Seventh Day, well, not Seventh Day Adventists, but they are Adventists who observe the Seventh Day, and they are very strict pacifists. The interesting thing about all that is that in the First World War, the second major schism that the church experienced and that has survived to this time was over the very same issue, pacifism. So that issue has been an issue that we haven't come to terms with very easily. One last thing about this fellow's research, which is really quite interesting. He did a very close analysis of the Act for the Enrollment, or Act for Conscription, and looked at the 17th Amendment to it, Section 17, discovered that for the church, any church, to be able to get exemption from the government, they had to have rules, doctrine, and practice of its people consistently who were conscientious objectors. And the fact was that the Adventist church didn't have rules, and they didn't have consistency, and we weren't even sure what our beliefs were. Originally, James White said it's okay to fight, and if you have to kill someone, then the country's responsible, not you. So there was a debate going on in the review over that issue. And in order to get exemption, when Andrews went down to Washington and met with the Provost General, they had to speak what in educational parlance we call aspirationally. You know, when the accrediting body comes to your university and you describe yourself as you see yourself to be next year, but you can't really document that it's happening, you don't do that at Loma. No. Expressing yourself aspirationally. Some people call it fudging or just telling untruths. But the reason we were able to achieve non-combatant status for the church was because we were speaking aspirationally. And maybe the government recognised that it was also speaking aspirationally, trying to find a way forward out of this mess. So it was a messy business all around.
Michelle Lee spoke. She's from the University of Texas, and these scholars were so objective and so nice. I didn't even know she was a Seventh-day Adventist. I didn't know she was. She spoke about sacred time and Sabbath keeping in the late 19th century American culture and emphasized the sound of Sabbath. One of the Sabbatarians objected to people desecrating the Sabbath with noise. And it was a very, very interesting one. Now, on the second day, David Trim, our fearless leader, gave a nice Bible study about the importance of history. And Ted Wilson came in and he spoke and gave us some nice quotes from Ellen White. And then these others
He asked us to be gentle on the pioneers.
Yeah, he asked us to be gentle on the pioneers, except for Snook and Brinkerhoff. Ruth Kokambi, this is an Australian university, right? And she spoke about anti-Christian movement in China in the 1920s from an Adventist perspective. We had two great presentations about mission history, essentially. And I was interested when we did our book fest here that we had several books about missions and so on. So we're still in that Adventist tradition as well. Eric Anderson spoke, and he spoke about the Wizard of Tuskegee, which would be Booker T. Washington, and the Seer of Elmshaven, contextualizing Ellen White's understanding of American race relations. And he really kind of rehabilitated Booker T. Washington. And without saying so, he helped to rehabilitate Ellen White on race too by doing that. Yes, because she was following his approach. Doug Morgan spoke on James Howard and the rise of Adventism as an African-American religious alternative. I've never heard of James Howard, but he was very prominent. He was a physician in Washington, D.C., and boy, he stuck with the church in spite of some real sharp disappointments in the way the church related to race. So that was a very interesting too. Then we had these folk, and I'll get to them. Lisa Diller, My Adventist Family History, Myths, Oral Histories, and the Archives. She is a relative of the Fords. And so she talked about the Fords and gave us some new insights into that mission story and the importance of Mrs. Ford, which we hadn't fully understood before she spoke about that. From the GC Archives, Ashley Chisholm spoke on Out of Her Sphere, Jenny Thayer and the Victoria era. Jenny Thayer was an Adventist editor, copy editor. She kept a diary. And in fact, Gil spent some time looking at that diary after the conference was over. But anyway, that was interesting. He was sort of proto-feminist. And then I put Gil's session up here because it was one of the, I took this off of the screenshot, which included Tim Poirier. I want to mention this because, you know, when I was at the White Estate many years ago, I helped bring Tim Poirier into the White Estate. I later left, and Tim has been there for 37 years. And, you know, Gil and I haven't always done things that the White Estate liked. But when Tim got up to introduce us, Tim showed all of our books, including some that the White Estate didn't particularly like. This one about the history of the White Estate, and this one about the prophet and the presidents. He showed my old book about Edson White and race relations, and my new book about the history of White Memorial, the centennial history of White Memorial. One of the things about this conference, they said, okay, we have 10 more minutes. They said, I asked, are you going to publish these papers? And he said, no, we're not going to publish these papers because many of the people want to publish them in their own books or they have their own place. I said, oh, okay. Well, I'll publish mine too in a book. So I said, I am going to write a book called Visions and Revisions, a textual study of Ellen White's writings. Some of these things I've written years ago. I've already got 5 chapters of it. And this will be the first book that on the cover you'll see Ellen White writing, and you'll see Clarence Chrysler revising Ellen White's writing. He didn't mention Gil's new book, because Gil's topic was personal diaries as sources for the study of Adventist history. filling in the context of Adventist events communities. He's got a manuscript on Jane Andrews, Adventism's path-breaking scholar evangelist. Now, subtly, no, maybe not so subtly, that book will also be a history of James White and what it was like to live with James White and to survive James White. So there we have those things. Now, let me move quickly. To
Before you
yeah, go ahead.
head in that direction,
Okay.
Ron, let me just share with you a little about the paper that I presented on diaries.
Oh yeah, okay.
I've tried to put together a catalogue of the diaries that are available for early Adventist church history. We have quite a number for later church history. In the past, our approach to understanding church history has generally been through political type documents. You know, reports in the review, or articles that have been written in the review, actions taken that are recorded in minutes or in general conference sessions. So it's a kind of an official perspective on church history. We fill in some of the background through letters or correspondence between leaders. But increasingly, we're becoming aware that there is a rich source of information available in diaries that people kept. And this view of church history is really a view from the bottom up, rather than the top down. It's a perspective of social history, the social history of Adventism. And you get some really fascinating new insights into the backstories of what happened in our church development. In my study on Andrews, I found the diary of Angeline Andrews exceptionally helpful for the family life approach.
It's here in our library here.
Yeah, here at Loma Linda. Ron used it for some earlier articles, and I was able to explore it in much more detail to flesh out a number of issues, reflections on theological issues, as well as leader relationship issues. In recent times, we found that there were diaries that we didn't know existed previously, but they were there in the archives all the time. We've just discovered recently a fragment of a diary, it's about 1.5 years long, of Harriet Smith from 1869 to 1870, which tells a fascinating backstory of the time when James White was ill, really ill, acting erratically, suffering badly from his stroke, and recovering very slowly. And the uncertainty of the colleagues around him as to whether he would actually survive. So what do you do when you're not sure that this leader is going to survive, but he's still wearing the label of leader? How do you work around and nurture him, but also take decisions that he's not happy with, and that later when he gets well, he'll criticize heavily? So that kind of information, the visits to Ellen White's house, the extreme emotional distress that Ellen White experienced, and the quarrels between James and Edson, and the literary assistants or the household helpers that walked off in a storm because of the quarrels going on in the house, and the sense of desperation that Ellen White was experiencing at the nadir of James White's illness. That kind of information we just didn't know before, and that's become available through Harriet Smith's diary. We also found another diary from a two non-Adventist sources, but who were related to Adventist leaders. Jane Andrews' auntie, non-Adventist auntie up in Paris Hill, lived across the road from the house that James and Ellen lived in, shared with John Andrews' parents when they were first beginning the Review and Herald, writing it on the kitchen table. And this non-Adventist auntie gives us a perspective on the Adventist ethos and the feeling that you get when you hear Adventists talk about their doctrine. Not a hopeful Advent, it's a bleak, dark Advent, and there's nothing but judgment and destruction. That's this non-Adventist lady's perspective of these Adventists across the road from her. And she gives us insights into some of the extreme fanaticism that was characteristic of this Paris Hill community in Maine. She tells the story of the pastor of the church out at North Paris coming to visit her relatives, and this Jesse Stevens, the pastor, comes in and plants a very healthy kiss on the cheek of Jane Andrews' mother. And this non-Adventist auntie is just horrified at this brutish behaviour. She calls it just that. So some very rich insights from these diaries. And more recently, and I'll stop talking. More recently, a very rich diary that we found by the T.B. Lewis. T.B. Lewis, Theodore Bogardus Lewis, was the custodian of the Battle Creek Tabernacle. And he writes his diary for maybe 23 years. And you get an insight about the development of the church and major events in Adventist history, like the 1901 General Conference session, or the schism caused by Kellogg, the Kellogg apostasy, from the perspective of the custodian of the tabernacle, who later became the elevator operator in the hospital across the road, who knew Kellogg personally. And in that diary, you get some perspective on changes in the history of prophetic interpretation, where we began to move from thinking that Turkey was the fulfillment of Daniel 11 and the forerunner of Armageddon, to the issue of the papacy, and how the General Conference didn't like what some pastors were saying in the new view of the Eastern question. And Theodore Bogardus Lewis's son was a pastor who lost his job in 1915 because he was preaching a different view of the Eastern question. General Conference and his local conference employees. So diaries are a very rich source of a new understanding, a fresh, not a contradictory, but rounding out the larger picture of the way our church has developed, and the way you can see by faith, not by any historical evidence maybe, but the workings of providence in our development.
Well, Gil has a whole other presentation we were going to get into briefly about Adventism and fundamentalism, but you can hire him for another session later.
Or in 2 weeks he can come back and share.
Well, no, after yours, people will have even a broader view, and then he can come back, because it's just fascinating, and I'm finding it very fascinating, because in part of preparing for my book, I'm going through Jane Andrews' 1910 letter to W.W. Prescott's letter to Willie White, where he makes 106 suggestions as to how the great controversy should be revised. And I've studied each one of them, and actually Prescott had more influence on that revision than we have given him credit for. And there are places where the thought is changed, and I will have those examples in my book when the time comes. So now we're ready for audience questions. And
in regard to the non-combatancy, those that were traced, were they of the Union or the Confederacy? And my understanding, my grandson is a history major, graduated cum laude from Southern. He did a paper on non-combatancy and presented it out here a couple of years ago. And he did it on the Mennonites because he couldn't find enough information on the Confederacy. Is that anything to that?
I don't, did he find any
I don't think anything on the Confederacy. There were not many Adventists in the South anyway.
Yeah. And those who sympathized with the Confederacy were excoriated. We were ready to put them out of the church.
There is a fascinating story about the White family and the problem of military conscription. The White in Wood Street in Battle Creek. And I don't know if I've told you this story before. If I have, you tell me and I'll stop. But the Whites lived in Wood Street, and the family that lived next door to them was the Lewis family, T.B. Lewis family, whom we know from this diary now. And T.B. Lewis's elder brother, Griffith Lewis, was a cornet player. And he volunteered for the military and went off to play in the Union Army, playing his cornet. T.B. Lewis, who writes the diary, was a good friend of Willie and Henry White. No, not Willie, Edson and Henry. And on the other side of the Whites' home was a trotting track that they used for teaching horses how to trot. And during the Civil War, the army took that over, the military took it over, as a recruiting ground and as a ground where they practiced marching the new recruits. And Henry and Edson, looking over the fence, were attracted to the practicing recruits. And they volunteered to play their fife and drum as the recruits marched around. And the White family, James and Ellen, were terribly worried about whether Henry would actually go off and become part of the military as well. It was during this time where they were practicing their drum and their fife and creating some noise in the community. Father came home from the publishing house in a bit of a storm and took his axe to the drum and put his axe through it down in the woodshed. That indicates some of the tensions that involved. And just one final thing, in order to minimize the attractiveness of the military for Henry, James and Ellen took their boys across to Maine, away from Battle Creek for 2 or 3 months in an effort to try and get them out of the way of temptation. Tragically, over in Maine, Henry caught pneumonia and died. Family came back totally traumatized by the loss.
That's one way to end tension. You end the tension on the drumhead by simply smashing it. Okay.
Right here.
Okay.
I had a question about Doug Morgan's presentation on Howard. Is this the same Howard that Howard University is named after?
No, I think he was a student at Howard, but he's not the one that... Howard University was named after one of the Civil War soldiers that helped the freedmen, was it not? I believe so, but anyway, go ahead.
Just a quick comment that might be interesting to this class. Jack Provencha's grandfather was convicted of deserting from the Union Army, but it was a mistake. And he was subsequently exonerated, and he is buried in a military grave with honor.
There you go.
The way that the church had to try and bring some consistent pattern between practice and aspiration was that after they had received recognition of non-combatant status, they actually disfellowshipped a person who volunteered and published that prominently on the back page of the review. So they began to sort of bring order to their understanding and consistency to the practice.
I appreciate so much you're going into the diaries for the texture of what's really and the mood of what's really going on, instead of just the board minutes and the official statements from the church entities. Another source, and I'm sure you're already thinking about it, are the casual comments in the paper, in the newspapers, the Gleaners and things like that, but also in the student newspapers, because the student newspapers will be a little bit more candid in their feelings about some things. I'm finding this in the 30s over at La Sierra. It gives a very different picture of the culture, which the official history of the church never touches.
we got some interesting insights into Prescott, W.W. Prescott, from the student newspaper that he edited when he was at Dartmouth College. I'm not aware of any student newspapers from Battle Creek College's early days, but they may turn up sometime.
You know, Michael making a comment reminds me that he's doing a lot of research and finding a lot of documents on Ancestry.com. Not only that, but if you live in San Bernardino County and get a library card, the San Bernardino County libraries, you can go in and you can use Ancestry.com without paying the monthly fee. And you can find a lot of evidence there, pictures and all kinds of data that you wouldn't find otherwise. So there's another source. I'll tell you, one thing that has revolutionized and will continue to revolutionize Adventist history is the internet and all of this all these digitized records. I mean, that paper about the Civil War could never have been done 30 years ago. I mean, I wrote an article like that 30 years ago. I didn't find a fraction of what he found.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. During the Civil War, the official church position seemed to favor pacifism, because you said they disfellowshipped this one person that went off to war. But in World War I, the official position supported the German Adventist church that supported combatancy. Is there tension here? Is there any linkage between these two events?
The linkage, I think, has to do with bearing of arms rather than actual participation in the military effort. And in Germany, in the First World War, the issue was very clearly, should you bear arms or not? And they faced the threat of firing squads if they didn't. So it was a very difficult dilemma for them in the First World War. In the Civil War, which was the only war that people in the First World War had to sort of go on as a pattern for how Adventists responded to the problem of military service, in Civil War, the provision that was made available by the government in their amendment to the Conscription Act in 1864 was that you could get exemption if you served in the military, served in the medical work, in the hospitals, or in the care of the freedmen. So the exemption wasn't, I guess there were those who sought it for pacifism, but the provision under Section 17 of the Act was actually for you to participate in the care of those that were affected by the war.
My impression of Chuck Sandifer, who served as ADRA director for many years, was that with the Adventist growth in many, many countries around the world, and with all the different challenges that Adventists face in terms of military service, that we have now very little witness against killing in war. There's just so many complex situations. So we still officially promote non-combatant service, but we're not going to disfellowship you if you pick up a gun.
Right here.
Where? Oh, okay.
You know that the GC released new manuscripts and letters, about 9,000 of them. Most of them never saw light, and I almost finished them, and there's a lot of history that we, the church, ignore. So if you want to learn history, I recommend you to look through those new materials.
Yes, there's not only the Ellen White letters and manuscripts, which we have in their polished form, but the White Estate has also released all the incoming letters, so a lot of correspondence there. And then on the General Conference archive site, you can get a lot of books and manuscripts, and the entire 1919 Bible Conference transcript can be downloaded. So between those two sources and Loma Linda's sources and these university sources, we can get a lot of things that we never used to be able to get.
Can I just piggyback on that comment for a moment with a little bit of social history to illustrate the kind of things that strike you, just from these recently released manuscripts, the letters on the internet. I was reading just last Sunday, or was it the Sunday before, a letter that Ellen White wrote to Mrs. Rousseau, who happened to be the wife of the principal, the new principal of Avondale College. And she was relating an incident in 1893 in Wellington, New Zealand. That's what caught my attention. She was relating an incident where the wife of A.G. Daniels, Mary Daniels, was visiting with another lady, Carey, in the flat in Wellington. A quarrel broke out, and the wife of the president gave Carey a good slap across the face. And Carey responded in kind and gave her a good slap back. And one sees actually the wonder of Ellen White's mediatorial role in this, the bringing of unity through what was clearly a very difficult social circumstance here between ministers who were stressed and their wives who were stressed, and the tensions that emerged. And Ellen White going backwards and forwards, talking to this one, talking to that one, and sort of sorting through the problem and bringing about harmony and peace, and the work went on. Carey became a Bible worker, and Mary Daniels would preach and became the wife of the General Conference president, eventually.
So sometimes you have to use an axe to break the tension, and sometimes diplomacy will help.
In 1918, First World War, the problem of bear arms was a big issue in Europe. And that was the thing that divided the Seventh-day Adventist Church forever over there. It's a Reformer Seventh-day Adventist when they don't bear arms, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which are still today the same.
Yes.
And the agony of the situation for the German folk and for Russian Adventists was that they were hoping that Ellen White would say something that would say it was okay to bear arms, or that they shouldn't. And there was silence.
She was dead.
No.
Oh, yeah, that's
no,
right.
she was 1914. 1914.
Okay.
They actually tried to, not prime the pump, but they tried to sort of bring her around to talk about the topic. They would talk about the war in general. They would talk about the stress situation in Europe and the uncertainty. But she steadfastly refused to say yes or no. Every believer needs to make the decision for themselves where they are. And that was her stance on that issue.
I wouldn't read too much into the fact of her silence at that time. And I think one of the studies we need to do is Ellen White's state of health and her mental acuity and her alertness between 1911 and 1915. Because it became a problem. Willie White sometimes had to explain things to her 3 or 4 times. And so maybe that she was silent was just wise.
Except when Conradi asked her the question earlier, when she wasn't quite as suffering from old age in the later period. She was reluctant then and reluctant later.
Okay.
So,
okay. Very good. Where are we? Okay.
So as Michael said, a new day has dawned for Adventist historians, given all the data that's out there and the sources that are coming our way. So here's my question. What's the White Estate stance with all this data coming? Is there a breadth of openness? What's our hermeneutical stance to all this to truly assess the actual history of Adventism?
You know, the White Estate itself and Jim Nix has to function within this tension in the church, where on the one side we have these functional fundamentalists, on the other side we have, you know, raging liberals. And so And so they have done a marvelous job of getting a lot of sources out there. And when I pressed them about publishing the handwritten materials, they were very reluctant, and I could see that the reason they were reluctant was in part because of the functioning fundamentalists who would be upset by that. An interesting thing has happened in Adventist history too that goes back to earlier books. Way back when, Fawn Brodie wrote No Man Knows My History, which was an iconoclastic revelatory biography of Joseph Smith. Fawn Brodie was a granddaughter of a Mormon prophet, a Mormon church leader. And then in 1976, Ron Numbers came along and he wrote Prophetess of Health, which we in the Adventist community saw as a terribly iconoclastic attack on Ellen White. I understand that some non-Adventists were criticizing Numbers for being too favorable to Ellen White. They see it from an entirely different perspective. But both of these books sort of enabled Adventist historians to say things that they couldn't have said before. Because compared to Ron Numbers, you sound positively conservative. And within Mormon history, and finally, Bushman, Richard Bushman, is it Richard Bushman? Richard Bushman writes Rough Stone Rolling. Is that the name of it? Rough Stone Rolling. Bushman made his career as a Puritan historian. Very stellar career, and when he retired, he wrote this biography of Joseph Smith. And if he had written that 40 years ago, he probably would have been defrocked. But now, the Mormon Church admits that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, on the basis of that. So the same process is happening in the Adventist Church. One historian goes this far, and then the other historians can go a little bit toward that, and so on. Now let me say, we think that Ted Wilson is getting all the criticism from the left. And then you look at the story about the Great Hope, this condensation of the Great Controversy, and you go on YouTube and put in the Great Hope and the Great Controversy, you see all kinds of people attacking Wilson as the omega of apostasy because he would dare to take out our distinctive beliefs out of the Great Controversy. I thought the 1911 revision of the Great Controversy was controversial. It's nothing compared to what Wilson is suffering now from the right. So there is this tension in Adventism, probably will continue. Okay.
Can I just add a comment to your question? From my personal experience, the availability of the materials has enabled new perspectives, richer perspectives. And one can write about those without being harshly iconoclastic. You can still seek understanding. And if the church understands that, I think they're quite sympathetic. I've found that the White Estate and folk at the GC have been very, very open to new understandings. And the publishing house also. Now, fortunately for me, I had George Knight as a kind of an advocate, and that helped to get some walls down. But my book on Ellen White and the Prophets is really quite pushing the boundaries in some ways, and yet Pacific Press was willing to publish that, and that's been based on new materials. And the Jane Andrews book will also create major new understandings, and there's a willingness to run with that, I hope. But there is, just commenting on what Ron was saying about some historians being able to work more freely because of work done by others, there's an article coming out shortly that John Butler has written for Church History, which is an analysis of the state of the art when it comes to Adventist historiography. It's a brilliant piece, worth reading if you can get the chance. In which he looks at the play between the Ron Numbers of Adventist history and the George Knights of Adventist history. And the bridging of those and the finding of new ways and the enriching of our understanding in the process. It's a really, really good article.
We Adventist historians are figuring now that if you want to believe in Ellen White, there is lots of apologetic literature and lots of things written that will support your position. If you don't want to believe in Ellen White, there's a ton of anti-Ellen White things that support that position. We are not going to change that. We don't need to change that. We don't want to change that. We want to simply understand. And so that's why we have this conference, Situating Adventist History in the context of the time. And there was no controversy at our conference. There was no controversy. And so we simply want to understand and not be detracting or writing what's called hagiography. So anyway, we're moving in that direction.
You know the phrase, those who ignore history are condemned to repeat it. If we look to the history of 1904 to 1907 about Kellogg's, I recommend to see that history because I think the church is repeating the same mistake that Kellogg and his friends did. And I have a friend that she belongs to the Reformed Adventist Church, and I collect a statement from the church documents that non-combatants documents are prior to the First World War. But I cannot find it now, but I think the church have made the decision long before the war that church do not participate in war. I promise to find it and give it to you.
Okay.
A very brief question for each one of you. What was the most challenging or the most exciting paper at the conference that you heard, besides your own papers?
You go first, I can't think.
I think it was Kevin Burton's paper for me because it was such a radical sort of reorientation of my thinking. So yeah, that was one, and I'm not sure that we have the full picture yet of that situation. But certainly he was breaking new ground. The other one that I really was challenged by was Nick Miller's paper, because he was trying to show that Adventists were not fundamentalists, and I'm convinced they are. But we don't want to be, and we can't afford to be. But originally we were. And he was trying to show that originally we weren't, from a philosophical perspective. So that was a challenging thing for me.
Well, I mentioned Michelle Lee's paper about the Sabbath, and it wasn't, it wasn't revolutionary or anything, but just the idea of taking a topic like this and bringing up an aspect of it that we'd never thought about before, the sound of the Sabbath. Think about your experience with Sabbath, and what are the sounds of the Sabbath? My mother playing the piano and singing Beyond the Sunset or something, It was just beautiful.
Was there, you've indicated that there was attention given to policies and practices in the Adventist Church. Was there attention given to theological sources that may have influenced Ellen White or other early Adventist leaders? I can't help but wonder if, for example, going through the Civil War, the greatest conflict, the most costly conflict in lives that this country has ever been through, if that didn't contribute to the vision of the great controversy as the overarching theological framework within which to understand the whole history of salvation and the role that Adventists are playing. Was there any attention to that? Was there any attention to, say, the Wesleyan understanding of salvation, justification, sanctification, perfection, things like that? Or was it mainly around issues of the sort that we've already discussed today?
Mainly around those issues, although the David Holland paper, and maybe Zach will talk more about this in a couple of weeks' time, the David Holland paper really tried to analyse where Adventism was placed in the larger philosophical world, and was looking at our doctrine of the nature of man and the immortality of the soul, and our move away. No, what we were called materialists because we believed in annihilationism, and where that fitted in the larger theological and philosophical picture. And his paper was really quite stimulating in that regard. And I guess Nick Miller's one was also somewhat theological, but those were, no, I tell a lie.
No, you did not deceive. You did not intend to
I
deceive.
forgot.
You did not intend to deceive.
Alex Ryrie is an Anglican scholar, theological, historical scholar, who looked at Adventism's place with its apocalypticism in the larger Protestant picture. So his had a theological perspective as well. That will be very helpful for us, I think, when he's finished his paper and shares it. So those people, I think, Adventists tended more to look at the more regional or the more local issues.
Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen. And then next week, Neil and Kutsi will be back to continue his, and then Zach was going to be here, in 2 weeks, right? So, and then we're going to get you back, Gil. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.